Welcome to the Probasco podcast. I'm Claudia Kramer, the Probasco Chair of Free Enterprise here at the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga. And today I am welcomed by Dr. Russell Sobel, Professor of Economics and Entrepreneurship at the Citadel. Thanks for coming, Russ.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Kramer.
Thank you. All right, so today we're going to talk about a big chunk of your research, which is on entrepreneurship. And so one of the things I think would be fun for us to start is for you to just tell us how you got interested in studying entrepreneurship. And honestly, what is it? What is it to an economist, in the way that everybody thinks about it? And I think that'll just kind of be helpful to kick off the conversation.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. It's actually a pretty funny story how I got interested in this topic. I was a professor of economics and just really was focused on mostly issues related to government policy, like tax policy, and focused on how those affected the economy a little bit more generally. And I really wanted to create a free market institute or center up at West Virginia University, where I was at the time. And so I went to the dean and pitched this idea. I'd like to have a center, and said, well, we don't have any money for that, but I just got a big donation to start an entrepreneurship center. Would you like to tackle that? And I'm like, well, let me think about it. And I decided that I wanted to do it and maybe try to morph it into something that was a little more along the lines of something I was interested in. So anyway, so I was the founding director of the West Virginia University Entrepreneurship Center. And one of the first things I did, other than starting a student business plan competition and starting a business incubator, was tried to start a research program that melded together both economics and entrepreneurship. So I started out by trying to just do a really good literature review in economics to see what people had done on entrepreneurship. And I'm really a data kind of guy. I love to, get data and run statistical tests and this kind of thing. And unfortunately, most of the work that I ran across in economics was by scholars from the Austrian School of Economics who didn't do a ton of stuff with numbers and data. It was more just a narrative, theoretical kind of thing. And then I stumbled across an article by an economist named William Baumol. And while it was narrative, it seemed to have an easily testable prediction. And so I ended up trying to take his work and subject it to some data analysis, and it just started there. And so for the last 25 years, I've been working on statistical analysis of how government policies influence the rate of entrepreneurship. And then when I moved schools to my new school, where I'm at the Citadel in Charleston, South Carolina, back in my hometown, now I'm full-time teaching entrepreneurship there. I don't even teach economics anymore, so I teach several different entrepreneurship classes. And so I've got a class I teach on technology, entrepreneurship, which is a lot of fun. And so I've kind of expanded my horizons and been working a lot on topics related to entrepreneurship. So now let me transition to the second part of your question, which is, how does an economist define entrepreneurship? Mm-hmm. Actually, I think this is way more fascinating than you would think. And I'm going to start my talk tonight that I'm doing with this, because I think everybody says, oh, we know what an entrepreneur is. But by the second slide, I have people confused on what an entrepreneur is. And I love that about it, because you think, oh, we all know Elon Musk is,
right.
That's what we but all of a sudden, I start asking, well, what about, I've got an example I use in my talk, Jerry and Jordan Olson. They own a Subway franchise. Okay. And here's the interesting story behind them, is that they actually met at that Subway when they were teenagers. They both worked at the Subway. They got married, moved off to California, halfway across the country from there, and the original owner of the Subway ended up passing away, and they found out the franchise was up, for sale, and so they bought it. They let the current manager just stay managing it. They live halfway across the country. Okay. They never go there, but they're the owners of this Subway franchise 5 states away. Would you consider them entrepreneurs? Mm-hmm. I mean, and my class will sit and have a heated debate over whether we should count people like that as entrepreneurs. And it's really a question of, do you count all business owners as entrepreneurs, or do you only count business owners who are doing new and innovative things like Elon Musk is with SpaceX or Tesla, these things that change the world, like Henry Ford kind of people. Right. And, and it's funny because my class will be about equally split of whether we should count every, person who runs a small business as an entrepreneur. A guy who does pressure washing of houses. There's nothing new and unique about that, but he runs a small business. Is he an entrepreneur? And then I have more fun with them, because then I like to say, well, what about people who aren't in the business sector at all? What about Abner Doubleday, the guy who invented baseball? Or Elbridge Gerry, the politician who invented the whole concept of gerrymandering. Or, Blackbeard, the pirate, who, as we have a friend who does a lot of work on the economics of pirates, I mean, he ran 3 ships of men, went out on risky adventures where sometimes he lost money, sometimes he made money. What about this broader conception of entrepreneurs who are agents of change? And so as I view it, there's really like 3 possible definitions of what it means to be an entrepreneur. There's the narrow definition that only counts for-profit ones who are truly innovative, the Elon Musk of the world. Then there's the more traditional textbook definition, which is all business owners. If you look at a management textbook, that tends to be the one that's closest to them. So they would count the Subway owner. Okay. And then there's this broad conception, which I think most economists, would probably, as long as I had a chance to sit and talk with them and say, yeah, that's probably right, because William Baumol's idea that got me so interested in this is really about the fact that there's creative people everywhere. It's a question of how they allocate their time and talents. And in some societies, you want to allocate your time and talents. The way you can make the most income is by opening a private sector business. But say that you're a creative individual who lives in Cuba or North Korea. That's not an option, right? So, but it's the same creative people, but they're spending their time and talents in other ways, right? And so they're just agents of change. And I've kind of I cover a lot of different ones. I mean, obviously there's military generals who change the way wars are fought, but there's academic entrepreneurs who change the way universities are run. I've got a colleague, Dr. David Duplass, who when he ended up writing a huge SBA grant to start this center at the Citadel that helps veteran entrepreneurs who want to open businesses. That center didn't exist before he's there. He's changed, but it's not a for-profit business, and he's not even the dean of our school. Like, is he an entrepreneur? Well, he's certainly an agent of change, right? So that I think this broad conception is kind of a good way of looking at it. But if you start reading the literature, Joseph Schumpeter, who I'm going to be speaking about, at more length, had a very specific idea of what it meant to be an entrepreneur. And I think as you read, different people have different conceptions of what it means to be an entrepreneur. Maybe we can talk more about their ideas.
I think the agent of change idea, there's something there with that. You mentioned the Austrian school. And so I want to go back to that idea and with trying to define entrepreneurship. And so Israel Kirzner comes out of the Austrian school, and his work, what he's known for, is kind of on entrepreneurship. But I agree with you that that's less well known. Even, I would say those ideas are not that mainstream even in the economics literature, and I don't think it spills over into management or any of the other fields. And so give kind of a brief overview of maybe Kirzner's view of entrepreneurship and contrast that a little bit with Schumpeter, since that's a lot of what your talks are going to be based on while you're here in Chattanooga.
Yeah, so Israel Kirzner had a very specific definition of entrepreneurship. And for him, entrepreneurs were people who discovered previously overlooked or unnoticed profit opportunities and act on them. So, and what I really like about his definition is that you see the cartoons where it's got somebody with a light bulb above their head. And I think that's really what Israel Kirzner thought of, was that there's this pure aspect of discovery, the thinking of something that other people haven't thought of or that they've overlooked. And maybe it's just that you need a new pizza delivery place in this part of town that one doesn't exist and somebody else hasn't done it yet. But it's this idea that there's this discovery aspect of seeing something that other people have overlooked. But I think what is most important about Kirzner's ideas is that Kirzner really thought that that discovery process was incentivized by the profit mechanism. That is, if you look at the amount of discoveries that take place under capitalism in a place like the United States versus the number of discoveries and innovations that are coming out of somewhere like the former Soviet Union or Cuba, it's not that they don't have as many creative people. It's that the lure of the profit reward is what incentivizes people to make these discoveries.
Yeah, that's a great summary and a great way of thinking about it. And so then would you put Schumpeter in that camp, or would you put him more in a way of thinking about entrepreneurship as more of the agent of change? And does it have to be driven by profit opportunity, right? So there seems to be what happens when you're not operating in a market context. So then are you entrepreneurial or not?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So it's very interesting to compare them. Kirzner's entrepreneur, if you know economic theory, in most of our models, we have this equilibriums, like where supply and demand are in balance. And, equilibrium is the idea that if you took a metal mixing bowl you might use to combine ingredients for your meatloaf in, and you dropped a marble in it, it would roll around, but eventually it would come to rest. And that's what an equilibrium is, right? And, if you think about what the Kerzner entrepreneurs do is they come in and they see profit opportunities and they act on them and they end up eliminating them. It's kind of like the competition model where there's profits, people enter and compete those profits away. So you might say, well, Charleston, where I'm from, had this big tourism boom, and all of a sudden room rates on hotel rooms went from like $100 to $300 a night. Huge profit opportunity. People are building hotels there. Those are like the Kerznerian entrepreneurs.
Okay.
Now, let's switch gears, because I think what's so cool is that Schumpeter really viewed entrepreneurs as these disruptive agents in the world who come up with new ways of doing things that displace the old way of doing things. His concept of creative destruction, where the car is replacing the horse and buggy. So they're moving markets that were in equilibrium into disequilibriums. And in his work, he's very clear that to him, an entrepreneur is somebody who's trying to introduce into the commercial marketplace a new combination of resources. And he even said that once the business is up and running, that person no longer is an entrepreneur, just he's managing a business. So he really, it's not that a person is an entrepreneur. He really viewed the entrepreneur as more defined by the function of trying to introduce a new combination of resources into the economy. It's a new combination of labor, capital, whatever, But like Henry Ford is a good example of that. He neither invented the car nor the assembly line, but he's the one who said, "Hey, I'm going to bring assembly line production to try to produce this car in a way that brought it in the hands of everybody." So he's a really good example of somebody that Schumpeter would say, "That's what I mean by entrepreneurship."
Okay.
But it's only when Henry Ford was starting the business. Once Ford Motor Company was up and running, to him, that's just a managerial role and is not really the same thing.
So do you see there being a unique kind of role for providing assets? Because in reading some of this literature myself, I feel like at times authors will try to classify entrepreneurs if they're a residual claim or if they have skin in the game, if they have capital in the game. So in some sense, thinking about your Subway couple, well, they have their capital invested. But then thinking now of how you just described Henry Ford, once it's up and running, now he's a manager but not an entrepreneur. But he would have assets within the company. So that is another, I think, interesting way that I've seen people try to splice an entrepreneur versus not an entrepreneur.
Yeah, so it's very interesting because I've led this debate in my classroom so much. It seems that there's several dimensions that people really care about when they're making the decision of whether they want to classify somebody or not. One of which is whether the person is the residual claimant or has assets at stake. Are they taking risks, financial risks with the business, right? And obviously that is something a business owner does, even if they just own a Subway, is that they have assets at risk. But the devil's advocate part of that I like to play is, well, suppose you went to a venture capitalist and you got money from the venture capitalist and he owns part of your business. Or say you go to a banker who makes you a loan. Does that make the banker an entrepreneur because he's now got a financial risk in your business? How about I have a financial risk in Apple Corporation because I own some Apple stock. Does that make me an entrepreneur?
Right.
And all of a sudden we're like, no, that's not what we mean.
Yeah.
So, by itself, the financial risk, it's part of it, but it's not sufficient.
It's not enough.
Right? Then a lot of people care about how active of a role are they playing. Like a lot of people would look at the Olson example that I gave you and say, look, these people are 5 states away. They're not actively every day there. And so some people really care about how active of a role somebody is playing in the business that matters to them a lot. They're like, well, if they work there every day and whatever, or some people care about whether they were the ones who started the business versus taking it over. There's all these different dimensions, and there's just not a widespread agreement on it. But I think that's what's so interesting about it.
I agree.
Yeah.
It makes it a fun conversation.
Yeah.
So we've mentioned Joseph Schumpeter. You have a recently published book, The Essentials of Joseph Schumpeter, which is available for free on the Fraser Institute's website. And so let's kind of shift gears, talk a little bit about the book, because you're going to give 2 talks while you're visiting us here in Chattanooga. And so one to the Rotary, and then one is the Burkett Miller Distinguished Lecture. And so for the Rotary talk, you have brought up this idea based on Schumpeter's work of kind of, is capitalism sustainable? So that shifts gears a little bit into trying to think about this role of entrepreneurship, which in some sense happens under a capitalistic system, and we can kind of get into that and to the rules of the game aspect of it. But what was Schumpeter's thoughts in terms of looking into the future and trying to understand where he saw kind of capitalism going?
Before we get there, I think one of the things that we need to get out of the way so that we don't have to do it as part of that argument is to talk about what Joseph Schumpeter is most famously known for, which is his concept of creative destruction. I mentioned it a minute ago, but the critical aspect of his theory of creative destruction is that we always think of entrepreneurs like Henry Ford as being people who create something new, bring something new into fruition, which is true. But there's a whole second part of that process, which is it eliminates and destroys the horse and buggy industry. Mm-hmm. So what entrepreneurship really is in Joseph Schumpeter's view of the world is this process where new goods and services and means of production transform the world and eliminate or render old ones obsolete. The horse and buggy industry, tens of thousands of people who worked in it disappear. It's Netflix replacing Blockbuster. It's this continuous process of firms replacing firms. And why it's important to talk about that is it's a process that's very disruptive. And, people don't like losing their jobs. And the minute your company is being threatened by foreign competition, or a mom and pop store is being threatened by Walmart, or maybe more of the listeners would be familiar of, Uber and Lyft recently as they've entered markets that taxi drivers are protesting. There's a lot of places in the world where there were violent protests by taxi drivers over this, and countries where ride-sharing services have been banned to try to protect the taxi industry. And, it's one of these things where it creates a lot of tension and a lot of demands for people who are being displaced to get the government to step in and slow it down. And I think you see these debates now happening with artificial intelligence and AI. I mean, the writers in Hollywood went on strike over this, and, because they're worried about their jobs being replaced. And so entrepreneurship is a very disruptive process that creates this large contingent of people who are current business owners and benefited from the very freedom to try to start a business, who then, once they're running a business, seek government to step in and restrict the ability of other entrepreneurs to do that because it's threatening their livelihood. And, politicians need votes and need to get reelected. And what better way to do that than saving a bunch of jobs at the steel mill in your town, right? And, so there's these now transitioning into the question that you originally asked, is that Schumpeter has a whole section of his book, Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy, about can capitalism survive? And he thinks it can't, which I think is very interesting because, Schumpeter is viewed as one of the biggest proponents of capitalism, a free market person, and he's got this whole prediction that capitalism is going to be replaced by socialism one day. And he thinks there's three reasons why, but one of them is this idea that there's just this increasing pressure on government to slow down the process of creative destruction, which, to him, this creative destruction is our main driving force for prosperity over time. Over hundreds of years, the reason we're better off today is because we have cars rather than horses and buggies, and there's no more army of unemployed horse and buggy people. It doesn't mean it was easy on them in the short run, but there's all these demands, to try to alleviate these short run transitions. And so he thinks that there's going to be a lot of pressures on government to restrict markets and restrict entry, and that's going to be one of the three things that causes capitalism to kind of go away or be replaced by widespread government intervention. But there's two other ones that he points to. One of which is that he's writing at the time of basically the Industrial Revolution, is basically when he grew up in kind of the early 20th century. And what was happening at that time is that, in America in the 1800s, most people were entrepreneurs. They were farmers, they were blacksmiths, people. There weren't these large firms like we have today. And what Schumpeter saw happening with the Industrial Revolution is the creation of these large companies like the Ford Motor Company, or whatever, or when we think of Apple, in these giant companies who employ thousands of people. And so the average person in the economy is not an entrepreneur anymore. And in fact, they get so removed from this aspect of being a business owner and running a business that they get disconnected from the whole thing that makes markets work, entrepreneurship and entrepreneurs. And he argues that it's going to become entrenched so much in these big firms that people will no longer look to these entrepreneurs as heroes. And I gave an example in the book about James Bond villains. If you look through time, James Bond movies have been being made for like 40 years or whatever it is, right? Early movies, it's these Russian, generals or spies that are the villains, and now it's like CEOs of companies are the villains, right? And so, there's this thing where people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos are looked at as evil or villains, or not celebrated as the heroes that they really are. And so, to him, this process by where we tend not to view entrepreneurs as heroes and get so removed from that is reason two.
So let me ask a follow-up before we get too far off of that. I like highlighting the idea that we are vilifying businessmen, and it's not just in James Bond movies, right? We see this across TV shows, movies now, I'd say for several decades. So the part of my question, and just even when I kind of noticed this happening, is why do you think that is? So is Schumpeter directly drawing a line from people become more and more removed from being an entrepreneur? So is it that they become disconnected from the wealth creating process? So they're no longer themselves owning a business and understanding kind of profit and loss and kind of feeling the competitive forces and that they've got to be innovative, and that's really what's driving prosperity? Or is it just more of the kind of the going into a job that's just like a day-to-day task instead of you're no longer being creative? Like, did he expand on that, or do you have other thoughts sometimes in terms of just like overall why we think that this happens, where we kind of are now vilifying the people who are creating wealth in our economy?
Yeah, I think both your ideas are exactly right. I mean, I think part of it is that, if you go talk to business owners think they're doing good for the world and helping the world, right? Mm-hmm. And when a large number of people are business owners, then you think, wow, what we're doing is a good thing. And when it's just a bunch of people working for a business owner who they feel like they're making more money and profits, and there's this envy aspect of that where, you see people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos with big yachts, and you think that's so unfair that they have all this money. And obviously there's this aspect where they feel like if those people could, just not have so much money, other people could have money. And what the whole point of that misses is that these people are creating wealth for everybody, not just themselves. And I think the problem is that we tend to start equating the search for personal reward with harming other people. And there's positive some activities and negative some activities, right? I mean, people in the world are always self-interested, looking out for gain for themselves. But there's fundamentally a difference between doing it by opening a barbecue restaurant that, where your customers are happy, your suppliers are thrilled. Like there's a new Swig and Swine barbecue restaurant in Charleston that I love. And so I just want to use it as a specific example. I love going there. When I leave, I tell them thank you, and they tell me thank you. I love eating there. They're not stealing money from me as a customer. I'm happy they're open, right? And one of my former students works there. He's like, this is the best place to work. He said, it pays more than my other job. I mean, their employees are better off because they're open. And an even funnier story is that the farmer that they get their hogs from was just this farmer who wasn't doing very well, and now they've expanded to like 6 different restaurants. They've opened 6, and so now full time this guy has bought a bigger farm. Their suppliers are better off, their customers are better off, their employees are better off, and they've done it. This search for personal return as an entrepreneur is making the world better off. It's productive. It's win-win-win for everybody, and it's not a good thing if you go out and steal from people or rape people and murder people, but those are violations of people's rights. And I think there's this odd equating of greed and profit seeking with violating the rights of others, theft, robbery, whatever. And the problem is it's not that the greed is bad. It's that the violating people's rights is bad. In a world where we don't violate people's rights, searching for personal gain by opening a barbecue restaurant doesn't make the world worse off. It makes it better off. And I think that has a lot to do with it. There seems to be this equating of greed, so to speak, with evil, as opposed to equating the violation of people's rights with evil, and that greed is just it's like gravity. It's like why did the plane crash? Gravity. Well,
yeah, that's not that helpful,
right,
in the explanation. Well, that made me think about just if the process of becoming less entrepreneurial or individuals becoming less entrepreneurial in their day-to-day life leads more to the zero sum thinking or not seeing the positive sum. So do you think that that's part of the explanation, or why is it so hard, it seems now, for people to see that the barbecue owner or Elon Musk is the same in the sense of how they're earning their profit is by serving others? So do you see that disconnect, or do you have any idea?
I don't know. I think that Schumpeter's argument was, right or wrong, was simply that it's much easier for people to recognize that when everybody's a farmer, everybody's a blacksmith, and everybody's working for themselves, they're part of that process, as opposed to just one person working for a big company that's kind of bureaucratized. And if you're an employee at McDonald's, it's very hard for you to think of the owners of McDonald's, even though it's the shareholders. And also, I guess that's another aspect of it. He talks about that the corporate form of organization separates this, where you've got, the owners of McDonald's are shareholders, right? And what are they doing? Well, they're not really the entrepreneurs behind it. They're, they're just making, and that's a whole aspect of it as well.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. All right, so that was kind of point one, the vilification of the entrepreneur. So what was his second
so the creative
point?
destruction and the demands for government protection, and then this kind of vilification of entrepreneurs and the not, as number two. And then his third one is maybe most controversial. He argues that basically that the immense productivity of capitalism creates a world where we don't have to subsistence farm anymore. It frees labor from the fields and from the factories, so that we end up with this intellectual class. College professors like you and I, and journalists, and so this large intellectual class of people who sit around pontificating all day long and are really removed from the production side of the economy. And in his view, that class then starts to turn on the very foundation of capitalism. They become anti-capitalist, anti-private property rights, pro-socialist. And, I think that if you were to look at the controversies today about conservative speakers on campus, or the uncook my campus kind of stuff, there is this in intellectual circles on campus kind of a, some people argue that it's a much more liberal mentality on these college campuses. BB&T Bank, when it was in existence, was trying to give money to endow chairs, and one of the conditions of the gift was that that they exposed students to the book Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. And there were some university professors who went ballistic when their universities were accepting those gifts, that the students were going to have to read these books. And I think it is kind of true that at the average college campus, that the average professor there is not a big fan of capitalism. And
the data supports that.
And what Schumpeter thought was so ironic about that is that the fact that these people can spend their lives being a college professor is due to capitalism generating so many goods and services that not everybody has to subsistence farm anymore.
We don't have to farm. We don't have to make our own clothes. We don't have to build our house at rate consistently. We can outsource all of that. So that thought I've also I ran across. I think I mentioned this to you earlier. Somewhat of a similar argument from the Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises, where he doesn't draw, I don't think, the argument as much of an anti-capitalist mentality to the intellectual class, but just that it breeds, so capitalism and the wealth-creating properties does seem to breed an anti-capitalist mentality where, because in some sense you are rewarded based on merit, and that creates more envy, and it creates a situation in which you basically have to work hard or work harder if you want more income, or if you want a nicer house or a nicer car. And so it does seem to set up this room for opportunity to do that. But at the same time, and I think maybe this is some of what Schumpeter was getting at, it's sowing its own destruction. So it's like, how ironic that. So do you see a way to combat that? Do you see your role as a college professor as part to combat, or by teaching the benefits of capitalism people will understand. So even if they're never an entrepreneur, they will be less likely to, vilify entrepreneurs.
Well, I definitely think that education is part of it and exposing people to ideas so they understand this. But, just the creative destruction provides such a good example. We can sit there all day and say it's really important that we let the horse and buggy industry die and the car replace it so that we have a society with cars rather than horse and buggies. But boy, if you're somebody who works in the horse and buggy industry, if you're somebody who raises 10,000 horses a year and sells them to the horse and buggy industry, you're not going to be happy about it. There's nothing I can say that's going to make you happy about that, right? And the problem is that there's that dynamic is what's so hard to overcome. Is that you can the people who are being displaced as part of that process are going to want government intervention to protect themselves, and so really it's a matter of, do you have a government where there's sufficient constraints in place so that government can't interfere? Like if Burger King wants to open up next door to McDonald's, run a McDonald's out of business, it should be allowed to do so, and government shouldn't be able to do anything about it, right? And that should just be a general rule. The government doesn't interfere in that, right? So I don't know. It's kind of constraints on government issue more than it is that. But, that's also then in turn, we get constraints on government and rules on government, and that's through popular opinion, being whatever. So the more people that believe that, yes, we should have a world where competition is allowed to flourish, then we adopt rules consistent with that. But
so you've mentioned within the creative destruction aspect, one thing I want to talk before moving on to our next topic is that people are losing jobs. So specific industries, specific entrepreneurs, and areas, with horse and buggy or the taxi cab. But that's a function of monopoly as well. So part of the issue there was they were granted government monopolies, right? They weren't facing any competition by design. But nevertheless, they are, fighting for more and more protection. And in these areas where they're losing jobs, one of the things that I think maybe I would like for you to touch on is it that overall employment is declining? Right, so with Schumpeter being such a strong advocate for capitalism, that we got these long run benefits, and everyone's made better off. It's not just top 20%, top half, wherever we want to cut that line. It's making everyone better off. So we've got a strong proponent of capitalism, but also identifying some people in the short run are going to be harmed. But long run, the employment and employment opportunities increase over time. Is that correct?
Yes. I mean, if you look, a very good example from my lifetime is when computers were first coming out and introduced. I mean, when I started my graduate program at Florida State University, the secretarial pool there that helped support the professors must have been 10 full-time employees who, there was, typed up the exams. Everything was hand typed with typewriters and all this. And now if you go visit somewhere like that today, there's one, maybe two people, right? And what that is that everybody has a computer on their desk now and can just print stuff in these copies, right? So it displaced all these people, but there's no army of unemployed, everybody thought the computer revolution was going to create this massive unemployment. Well, it did create a massive displacement of people, but markets are really good about helping to reallocate labor. That's one of the important things about the entrepreneurial function is that, one of the opportunities for entrepreneurs is to find these displaced resources and find new ways to redeploy them. A very good example is that, over the past, 2 decades, shopping malls across America, which used to be the center of towns, right, are sitting there abandoned. And I'm going to talk a little bit tonight, but I've been saying in my class for years, you figure out how to use those, you're going to make a lot of money because there's all this unemployed resources sitting around. Well, a new company called Pickle Mall is now expanding across the country, buying up old malls, turning them into indoor pickleball.
Oh,
and it's
that's
perfect
fascinating.
because
That is.
it doesn't depend on the weather and it gets the noise out of neighborhoods. But I mean, that's such a good example of what entrepreneurs do. They see these unemployed resources and they think, what can I do with that to make money? I mean, in my town, the interesting thing, we don't have the pickle mall yet, but the mall that I grew up going to, Now, half of it, the hospital system, which is downtown, wanted to expand, but they had no room downtown. So they created a satellite area that's taken up half the mall is the Medical University of South Carolina. And interestingly enough, you're not going to believe the other half of the mall is taken up by HBO. They filmed the Mighty
Oh, wow.
Gemstones series, Righteous Gemstones series is filmed there. And it's really funny because on the side of the mall, it says Gemstones Worship Center, right? And it's the old Sears. But anyway, yeah, they film HBO films in the mall. So, people... if there's a bunch of unemployed people in a town because a factory closes, that's a great place to go open a new business because there's a lot of skilled labor there that you can redeploy elsewhere. And, that's what entrepreneurs do. But it's not easy. It takes time for that process to happen. And, one of these things where anything we can do to help worker retraining or make it easy for people to experiment, and all these downtowns that were empty with the mom and pop stores closing are starting to open up now, and it's restaurants and all sorts of antiques. I don't know. That's just the process.
Yeah, I find it fascinating, but I agree that a lot of times people resist. Some people, it's just hard to, right? We can't predict the future, but we're confident in the market process of reallocating that labor and using it in a more productive way than how it was being used. I think a phrase that we use in economics that makes us sound heartless is we look at something like the internet, computers, and now AI as labor-saving technology, and that's a good thing in economics because then that means labor is getting freed up to go do something else, right? But that is more abstract and it's conceptual, and people hear that and immediately want to resist it. And I just find that tension, again, really interesting given that Schumpeter's writing at the time of the Industrial Revolution. He's not writing now. He doesn't see where we are, but we are still, in some sense, confronting some of those same, moral or ethical kind of dilemmas of getting people to kind of see the benefits of capitalism. And if you do rely on the market process, long run, we are all better off. And you do get another job. You do get a different job, but that transition can be tough. And I don't think we've done historically a good job as economists of maybe being sympathetic to that or empathetic to that.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I think hampers most economists is this fixation on this perfectly competitive model in the textbooks. And Schumpeter really lashes out against that in his work to a large extent. I mean, for him, what competition really was about firms replacing firms more than like you wouldn't say how competitive is an industry. You wouldn't measure it by the number of firms in the industry, which is how economists normally measure it. Schumpeter's like, example I give is a Blockbuster video. Its biggest competitor was Pick-a-Flick video, which is I actually worked at when I was a kid. But not the competition between Blockbuster and Pick-a-Flick that matters. It's that Netflix wiped both of them out, right? And interestingly enough, Schumpeter argues that most of the good things that we have in the world are brought to us by these firms who discover new ways of doing things. They're early on the action. They become basically little monopolies, earn monopoly profits, like Apple's make a ton of money, right? So you end up with these kind of big firms who expand, get big, have a lot of money. They use that money. R&D is Apple's, constantly innovating, but then they get replaced. So in his world, over time, it's this big firms being replaced by big firms that to him is the source of progress. It's not a bunch of small competitive firms. It's these large firms like Apple or Ford, that are changing the world and then getting replaced by one another. And even in social media, you may remember, I think you might be old enough to remember, MySpace was like the dominant thing, and it was taken over by Facebook. And then, now nobody likes Facebook anymore. But the point nonetheless is that those are large firms, dominant firms who then get replaced. Kmart was the biggest retailer in America in the 1970s. It got replaced by Walmart. Right. But the funny thing is Kmart actually replaced Montgomery Ward, who most people have never heard of. But it's this large firm replacement cycle of big firms that in Schumpeter's world, he says, despite the textbook picture, over the long run, even though at any point in time those might look like, oh gosh, we've got these big firms with market power earning economic profit. That over the long run, it's more of a more efficient of a process to have that process go on of firms replacing each other. We end up with a better outcome in the long run with that than if at every moment we were in this perfectly competitive equilibrium with zero profits.
Yeah.
over the long run, you wouldn't get as much
You
good.
wouldn't get as much innovation,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, so
Okay.
it's very interesting. So he's like a process which at no point in time looks efficient. Over the long run
Huh.
is the more efficient process.
Yeah, that's
And
great.
but the funny thing about that is it seems so controversial to talk about how great monopolies are, which was like what Schumpeter's talking about. But it really goes back to an interesting thing I like to talk with my students about is Israel Kirzner's idea that discovery is incentivized by profit. I mean, when you think about real-world monopolies, the vast majority of real-world monopolies are created by government.
That's right.
Government issues patents
Yeah.
to everybody for like this period of almost 2 decades, right, when you come up with an idea. So for 2 decades, when you come up with an idea, you have a patent that the government awards you and protects that allows nobody else to compete with you. And that's, people don't know about it, but like the drug industry, when you invent a new medical drug, you can patent that, and generics can't come out for 20 years to compete with it. That's why pharmaceutical prices are so high, because you have these monopolies. But, so here's the most puzzling and interesting question is, if monopolies are so bad, and the textbook says it's government's role to break up monopolies, why is it that the majority of monopolies that exist in America are actually created by government patents? I mean, if you really wanted to get rid of monopolies, the first thing we should get rid of is patent law.
That is, I think, an excellent summary of some of the ironies. And one of the last points I wanted to bring up was kind of tying it back into Baumol, who you mentioned earlier, and that reading his work really got you into this intersection between entrepreneurship and economics, and then tying it back to government intervention in the marketplace. So we talk about entrepreneurship and agents of change and creative destruction, but you can have agents of change within the market. You can have agents of change in non-market settings and in government settings. And so kind of break down and go through your work in this particular space and building off of Baumol's insights.
Yeah, sure. I would be happy to. Kind of trying to tie this together where we were going with that last conversation is that, the argument in favor of patents, right? Why we should have them, and why the traditional person say yes, we should have them, is because when somebody creates something, that having that lure of those big profits leads to, Kirzner would say, the fact that you can patent it and have monopoly profits for a period of time leads to a higher rate of innovation than if we didn't have patents. People wouldn't invest, pharmaceutical companies wouldn't spend the time to invest in all this R&D if the minute they discovered a drug, somebody else just was able to do it, right? So it's this lure of profits that incentivizes discovery.
Okay.
Now, the reason I wanted to tease that out more precisely is that aspect is true whether it's in the private sector or through the government sector. Whenever there's a lure of profits, it incentivizes people to come up with creative ways to seek those profits and to earn those profits. And if that is getting government to subsidize your business, getting a new law passed that benefits your industry, a tax credit for electric vehicles. I mean, obviously, anytime a firm can, seek favors through government, or even people might want to go around. I mean, there's a lot of lawsuit abuse. And why does lawsuit abuse happen? Well, it happens because people are seeking profit, right? And they want to sue other people, creative ways to sue people. Class action lawsuits were an innovation, right? So it's this aspect that there's a lot of possible ways to earn profit in the world. You can do it in the private sector by opening a business. You can, try to sue people, to earn money that way. In fact, I hate to say it, but we have somebody in our community who's where I live who makes most of his money just lawsuits against everybody, and so everybody's very scared of this guy because all he does is sue people, and you just don't want to interact with him too much because you're scared if you do something wrong, he might just sue you.
Yeah.
But he doesn't have to work a job. He lives in our neighborhood and just gets his money from a bunch of lawsuits that he levies. But that's how he makes his living. And he's not a lawyer. I mean, he uses it. It's like I'm talking about just But anyway, so. But you can also, of course, seek it through the political process. There's companies who produce things for the government and are subsidized by the government, and these big economic development incentives. I mean, some of these are now over $1 billion given to single firms to locate in an area. Think about it. If you're a company and you can invest some resources, would you invest them in R&D, or would you invest them in the political process where you could get $1 billion economic development incentive? That's worth investing resources over. And so what Baumol's idea is that people are going to invest their time and talents to wherever they get the highest return.
Okay.
And so, and So we've got to ask ourselves, what determines the relative profitability of investing your time and talents in opening a new barbecue restaurant versus investing your time and talents in suing people versus investing your time and talents in lobbying your local representative to try to see if you can get some government favor? And the answer that I think is so interesting is it really depends on economic freedom. So and this is where I tried to tie Baumol's argument to my statistical research, kind of looping back to the beginning, is that at the time I was starting the center, the Economic Freedom of the World report was just gaining a bunch of steam and momentum. And what it does is it measures for each economy in the world the extent to which they rely on markets versus government central planning, pretty much, to organize their economies. And so the interesting thing to think about here is if you end up, say, in somewhere like Cuba or North Korea, where it's 100% government controlled economy, you can't open a private. The only way to earn a return for yourself personally is through seeking government, right? Working your way up to be a government official or whatever. And so the larger is the government sector and the more resources they control and the more they're willing to intervene in the economy, the more lucrative is favor seeking through government. And also, the bigger government gets, the higher the taxes are. That lowers the return to private sector entrepreneurship because the return is net of taxes, right? So, if you live in a place that's economically unfree, there's so many rules, regulations, such high taxes, and then government controls so much of the funding and resources of the economy that it channels more of the proportion of entrepreneurship towards the political process. And if you end up in a place that's very economically free, where it has low taxes, low government intervention, then opening a business is extremely profitable, and there's not a lot of opportunities for gain through the political process. So more people devote their time and talents there. And I used to joke when I was up at West Virginia University, is that most of the engineering graduates had to leave the state because it had a very bad business climate there. There wasn't a lot of industries there, so there wasn't a lot of productive things to do. But boy, the political science majors and law school graduates could easily find jobs in that state because the government sector was so big and so involved that there was plenty of opportunities to in class action law, to be a lawyer and sue people or to go be a lobbyist and that's the problem, is that you end up in an economically unfree area and the best and brightest people go into that. In fact, my very favorite person I probably knew when I lived in West Virginia was a guy named Scott Rotruck. Scott Rotruck was brilliant. He used to teach as an adjunct for the School of Business there. I always thought he was one of the most brilliant people I ever met, and I would love to have worked for that guy. He was just one of those guys you looked at and said, I'd love to work for this guy. Smartest people. But where was he employed in West Virginia? Well, he's the head of government affairs for Chesapeake Energy or something. You know what I'm saying? Like, Chesapeake Energy is so regulated. Where do you put your best and brightest person? Dealing with the government regulators, right? Because they control, they have so much of an impact on your business that if you aren't paying careful attention to dealing with the government, it could ruin your business, right? So you put your best and brightest people towards the government affairs instead of in your R&D department, and that's kind of the link to Baumol, right? Is that it's not that we have when we look across areas and measure the differences in the rate of entrepreneurship, there's some places that have so much more entrepreneurship than others. And Baumol's argument is it's not that those places have more creative people. They have the same proportion of creative people as everywhere. It's that how those creative people choose to spend their time and talents is what differs. The reason measured entrepreneurship is so much higher in the United States than it is in Cuba isn't because we have more brilliant people. It's because here capitalism is thriving and you can open businesses very easily. And in a place like Cuba, you can't. So those people have to do other things.
Yeah, that idea between the productive and the unproductive entrepreneurship is fascinating, and I think is an area again that probably needs to be expanded on, researched more, shown that these are the consequences of government intervention in the marketplace, and that you'll get more and more people, even if it is within a private company, but their legal division gets larger because now they're, like you said, dealing with the government or dealing with government bureaucrats, or it becomes more profitable for them to try to seek government funds being subsidized instead of investing in R&D. And so I guess one last kind of question before we wrap up is you touched on it a little bit, but how do you prevent that? How do you prevent the unproductive or minimize the unproductive entrepreneurship and maximize productive entrepreneurship, given that a lot of it is how we can constrain government and then allow for economic freedom.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the constraints on government, the constitutional constraints are critically important for this, but the problem is those are very hard to change, right? Constitutional amendments are hard. That's very unlikely to change. So I'm very glad you asked that question, because now that I'm teaching entrepreneurship, one of the things I try really hard to do is I've got a class full of students who are interested in maybe becoming entrepreneurs one day. And I feel like that's my opportunity to talk to them about entrepreneurship. And the two things in that I stress in that class at different points are, one, back to this issue of wealth creation. I'm like, they've probably been exposed to this idea their whole life that the people who get ahead in business are ones who cheat their customers, try to pay their workers little, and try to cut their cost and ingredients and sell customers at high prices. I'm like, no, those are the people who get run out of business. Enrons get run out of business in our world, right? So I try to instill in them that their role as an entrepreneur is to create win-win relationships. They want be the swig and swine barbecue of the world, right? Be the guy who opens a barbecue restaurant in a building that's unoccupied because it's been by the way, the building they opened their first one in is a closed down mom and pop gas station. It had been boarded up for a decade. Yeah. They took this building that was not being used, found this wonderful use for it, and in the process they made their customers better off, their suppliers better off, and their workers better off. And they're a sustainable business that's growing rapidly. That's how you make, like I try to tell my students, the way you become successful is by creating win-win relationships in the world, not trying to take advantage of people. Don't go into business thinking the way to make profit is by cheating my customers, cheating my suppliers, and No, you go into business thinking the way I make money is by delivering a product that my customers love, and by having contracts with my suppliers that they want to keep doing business and keep supplying for me, and have employees who want to keep working for me, who want to show up and they love their jobs. That's how you make money. And so I think part of it is trying to educate our students that what being a capitalist is about is about making the world a better place and making everybody you deal with better off. And there's a fundamental difference between that and using the power of government to get subsidies for your business. And so I have a whole section on this covering these cases of companies who lobby and are able to get exclusive government contracts or drive their competition out of business through getting a government rule put in place. And I'm like, that's not, you can do that and there's nothing illegal for these things, but I'm encouraging you not to do that, because what you got to realize is that if you want to make the world a better place, that's not the way you do it. You do it by starting the swig and swine, not by getting your local representative to pass a law that somehow gives you some sort of unfair competition.
Well, I think that is an excellent. It's an optimistic view. It's a characterization of markets and capitalism that we don't hear enough, but then also contrasting that to when you are trying to be successful through using government, that is not the win-win. Right. Because that's not the narrative that we often hear. And I think that, again, your analogy there with the swig and swine and then just trying to seek government favor is probably not even what people's intention, right, when they think about they want to be an entrepreneur, but they can be incentivized to go down that path. But I think it sounds like you're encouraging them to resist that. And if you're really trying to create win-win for the world and make the world a better place, it is about building those relationships, and it's not about taking advantage of people, as you said. So I think that was an excellent way of kind of wrapping all of this up. Any last thoughts on entrepreneurship or Schumpeter?
No, I appreciate the opportunity to come discuss his ideas. I think, he's his term creative destruction is something that I think is fairly familiar, that people run across in the newspaper every day. But, this guy was such a brilliant scholar. And when I went to write the book, the Fraser Institute sent me his collected volume. It's like 4 feet high, a stack of books. And this guy had so many ideas. He was such a prolific author. And there's so many of these ideas other than creative destruction that I find fascinating. And not just fascinating, but kind of controversial and different from the way we normally think of things. And I mean, this guy's an economics professor at Harvard, president of the American Economic Association, talking about how monopolies are good and how it's this monopoly replacement, and we don't measure competition that way. And that is so foreign to what's in a Principles of Economics textbook. And this idea that capitalism, by its very, benefits it creates its own enemy. These ideas are just so very interesting, and I appreciate the opportunity to get to share some of Schumpeter's wonderful ideas with the world.
Well, we really appreciate it because his ideas are still very relevant, And I hope that our conversation sparks more conversations
Yep.
and debates and hopefully some research in these ideas. Well, thank you for taking
And
the time to come talk with us.
And I was just going to say again, if anybody's interested in learning a little bit more, it's a free book. I'm not trying to sell books here. Fraser Institute has a series called the Essential Scholar Series, and they have the Essential Joseph Schumpeter is the book that I put together. It's actually very short. It's freely available at PDF, and there's even some cute cartoon videos that explain the concepts in there. But there's also the Essential Adam Smith and the Essential Hayek, and there are a couple other scholars on there that there are books about too at the Fraser Institute.
We'll make sure to link to that as well.
Great.
Thank you, Dr. Sobel. Appreciate your time. This has been the Probasco Podcast.